Okay, with the Battle of Gallipoli or the Battle of the Dardanelles, the British, Australian and New Zealand and French troops were all designated or meant for the Western Front. However, when it became clear that a second front was needed, or was believed that a second front would be needed to crush the Central Powers, Gallipoli was chosen, as we've discussed just before. Now, this is the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles Strait. The Dardanelles Strait leads towards Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. Now, in preparation for this, the Ottomans had mined the Dardanelles, and the British knew about this. So, So for preparation for the battle, Australians and New Zealanders were being trained in Egypt, in Cairo in Egypt, and other bits of Egypt. There were other troops all over the Mediterranean being prepared. There were Malta, that is an island in the Mediterranean, was part of the British Empire, and actually until after until after the Second World War, it was still a British Empire, or part of that British Empire. Labourers from Malta were being prepared. There were civilian minesweeper crafts being prepared. So eventually, on the 18th of March, 1915, 18 battleships, including ships including minesweepers, were sent to the Dardanelles. Just draw them up. Yeah, red's probably the best colour to use. Okay. So, we can see the ships. Now their aim was to come through here and wipe out the mines. Now the problem was, it was believed that the Ottomans would be so weak that they would capitulate instantly from the bombardment from the naval firepower. Unfortunately, this was wrong. The Ottomans, in preparation, had divided their forces into three groups. The major force was up near the hills around here. There was a force around Kurtha and Akababa Hill, and there was a reserve group at Kumkal on the other side of the Dardanelles. So just imagine like the Murray River, like the size of the Murray and the size of this. Like, this is a lot bigger, yes, but just imagine it. And imagine guns being on the two sides of the Murray River. It's a bit like that. Pretty much, the Ottomans had prepared guns on either side. Now, a lot of the beginning when the British and French naval vessels came through, they knocked out a couple of the guns. However, they weren't as successful as they wanted, and they weren't as thorough as they should have been. They didn't focus on the guns completely, and they went straight for the mines. What ended up happening was they ended up losing quite a number of ships. France lost the Boulevardet that was struck by a mine, capsizing the ship. HMS Irresistible was sunk by a mine. HMS Inflexible was struck by a mine as well, but ended up surviving. And what was it? It was HMS Oceania. I got the name wrong. Was shot by artillery fire and was sunk. Or they had to sink the boat themselves and scuttle it, I believe the word is. So the battle began around 2 in the afternoon, it did not go well. The mines virtually were left intact. A common belief from some people in the Navy was, well, some people in the Navy at the time believed that the naval victory could have been won because the Ottomans would have run out of artillery. That, however, is very questionable, a reason to win a battle, but the battle was ended because too many ships that were sent were sunk or damaged far too early and far too quickly in the battle. So what ended up happening was the remaining ships were retreated. Additionally, a lot of these ships that they were using weren't the good ships of the Royal Navy. A lot of these ships were the older ships. What was it? HMS Resistible was the plans for its creation were late in 1885, I think it was, and its construction began in 1901. So I think the ship was completed in 1905. Actually, I could be wrong about that, but these weren't the fighter ships of the Royal Navy or the French Navy as well, because they thought the Ottomans would be very weak. Now, I'm going to talk about the positions on the peninsula of where Gallipoli happened, where the Battle of Gallipoli occurred. Cape Helles, ANZAC Cove, the Aegean Sea, Suvla Bay, Sed El Pal, Ekaba Hill, Kaababa, and Kumkal. Now, when the invasion happened, actually I'll draw up one more flag. So it's like a good pen, so it wasn't just British. So the French and the British landed at Cape Helles. While the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps that was formed in Egypt, combining the Australian Imperial Force and the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, landed at what would become known as ANZAC Cove. Now, what occurred to the Australian and New Zealanders was unfortunate, and it was realised after the battle, but a lot of the blame that occurred went on Winston Churchill after the battle, making him lose his admiralty, or his First Lord of the Admiralty position, I believe, in the British Navy, and in the Imperial Navy, British Imperial Navy, or Royal Navy, sorry. I believe the Australian and New Zealanders went too far north from memory. I believe the currents forced a lot of the rowing boats that the Australian troops were in. The currents forced a lot of the Australians to go further north than they were meant to, and they ended up coming against a lot of terrain that was not good for landing in. So we'll start the Battle of Gallipoli. I'll just draw up some things. Okay. So, on the 25th of April, 1915, the official Battle of Gallipoli began. This is the day that Anzac Day is named after, and the battle, the main part of the day is commemorating, or celebrating, or remembering, not celebrating, but as well as all the other wars, but this is what the day is made for. The battle ships from the Royal Navy and other Allied forces at the time began embarkation of rowing boats. So instead of landing crafts like we know today, that we used in D-Day and things like that, about 40 years or 30 years later in the liberation of Europe, they had to use rowboats. Like the romantic rowing boats you see in rivers, in the Yarra River. They had to use things like that. The problem was, they were meant to land at Baroon. Well, I can't pronounce the name properly. However, the first group were meant to land up here. However, because of currents, they got forced down to what would become ANZAC Cove. And they made inland. There were only 2 regiments posted there. The 29th Regiment of the 9th Division of the Ottoman Empire. Only 2 regiments were here. Use the blue to represent the Imperial forces. So they made inroads, and what was it? This area here was called the 400 Plateau, while this was called Plagueis Plateau, and this was called Russell's Top. Now, the objective of this was to capture all these spots. Unfortunately, this did not happen. Australian divisions did get to these points. Eventually, New Zealand and Australian division did make it to the Airblue too, and did making flanking manoeuvres. They did make it to the top of these areas in the daytime, while there were minimal defences from the Ottomans, since there were only 2 regiments placed on guarding these points. There was heavy casualties from on the Entente side, or on the Allied side. However, this was because of terrain. Where ANZAC Cove is, it's very rocky, very steep, and the Ottomans, with their rifles and their guns, could pick off Australians and New Zealanders quite easily. Additionally, Australians were not ready for this terrain since they'd landed in the wrong spot. All their maps were wrong, since they were made for Air Plateau of Bernu. So it was a bit of a disaster. Another problem was the terrain also broke up the regiments. So regiments got broken up and separated, making it easier for the Ottomans to pick off troops by themselves. So what ended up happening was Mustafa Kemal ended up, what was it? I think it was by the main attack the first attack by the ANZACs began at 4:30 in the morning. However, after around midday, Kemal had sent reinforcements and had forced the ANZACs off all points. All military officers and regimental heads who were there all demanded re-embarkation because they thought that the situation was untenable, since virtually all the Ottomans controlled all the high points and the Australians and New Zealanders had failed to complete any of the objectives. The problem with this was the British Navy refused, because they said it was virtually impossible to start re-embarkation now. So Hamilton, who was the head of the campaign, said that gave an order for Australian and New Zealand troops to dig in. So 25,000 ANZAC troops were on that area, so we'll just draw that up now. So another thing with the Ottomans was the Ottomans at one stage actually ran out of bullets on the first day, I believe. So Mustafa Kemal told all his troops to get down to avoid being shot and fix bayonets. And they did that as a bit of a scare tactic. So when Australians came to the top of the hill, they would do bayonet charges to try and ward off Australians from the tops of the hills. And then eventually reinforcements did arrive. Alright, we'll get to Cape Helena. Alright. Okay, on the same day, British, French, Indian, and other regiments of the British Army and French Army are landed on Cape Helles, or Helles. There were 5 landings, point Y, point X, point W, point V, and point S. These were all landings around the peninsula. They landed quite unopposed. There were only a couple regiments there. The 57th Infantry Regiment under Mustafa Kemal. The landing started on, they landed quite unopposed. The objective was to get Krita, the town. However, they were very ineffective because they were so broken up between bad landings. Or bad land that was just so broken up. It was very similar to ANZAC Cove, very rocky, very steep. And the small amount of defenders could hold a lot of the forces off. So what ended up happening was there ended up being they made quite good advances. 26th day they were here. Then on the 27th of April they got just on the outskirts of Kirithi. However, on the 28th, the first battle of Kirithi happened. This was a disaster for the Imperial forces because Ottoman forces had, actually we'll make them blue because I've made the Australians blue. Okay, so by the 28th, large regiments from the higher mountains had come down and tried to take on the ANZACs. The ANZACs were protected because the British had large naval vessels in the Aegean Sea that could bombard the hills of ANZAC Cove, or on the hills of ANZAC Cove, and could could get rid of the Ottoman advances. However, here they couldn't because the British and the French were going so far inland. They could still bombard, but it was less effective. So what ended up happening was new Turkish divisions came down, and there were good plans set up for the Battle of Kirithi, but the thing was the plans got broken up because regiments got broken up between the mountains. They couldn't form regiments and units properly. So, additionally, that thing that I said about the Turkish running out of ammo actually didn't happen at ANZAC Cove, happened at this point. Nearly whole Turkish regiments got injured or killed in that stand. but it definitely held off a lot of the Entente, or the Allies, from advancing. Virtually what this caused was it caused the British, the French, and the Australians and New Zealanders and all of Entente to fail their objectives. They had failed to capture the major towns and the high points in the peninsula. This caused, in fact, on the 28th, for the Australians to be trapped on ANZAC Cove. It caused the British and the French to be stuck in a stalemate. With the Ottomans. So, what this did, it meant that the whole purpose of this campaign was to defeat the Ottomans and kick them out of the war as quickly as possible without doing a war of attrition like it was occurring on the western to prevent a war of attrition on the Western Front. So, what ended up happening was this has occurred again. Now a war of attrition is occurring with virtual trench warfare happening again. And all the objectives literally were failed by the 28th of April. So only a couple days after. Alright, with the campaign 1915, the main fighting occurred, or the final fight, in reality, occurred in what was called the August Offensive. Virtually fresh Australian troops tried to push Australian, New Zealand and British and French troops tried to counterattack at once to try and capture strategic points. The Ottomans, who were also quite weak at this stage, both sides were very weak at this stage, took new positions. However, virtually at every point the Ottomans defeated the Entente. Was it the August Offensive, the Battle of Sari Bair? That was an Ottoman victory. Battle of Krith Vineyard, Ottoman victory. Battle of Lone Pine. That was an ANZAC victory, but it was a very high cost. And even when there were victories and they captured points, the losses were so high that literally within a little while later they had to give up land and were pushed eventually back to where they originally were. So eventually what ended up happening, after the August Offensive had virtually failed, the new numbers were needed on the Western Front, and as well something else happened. We'll talk about that now. One of the major points of the Gallipoli campaign was to knock the Ottomans out and divide and conquer. and get supplies through to the Russians. In early 1915, that was possible because there were no Ottoman allies except for Austria-Hungary and Germany, and they were all the way in Europe dealing with their own problems. They could send commanders and a little bit of help and block shipping with their naval vessels, but they couldn't really do anything else past that. However, I will look up the date. Okay. Sweet. Okay, on the 6th of September 1915, Bulgaria entered the First World War. Now, I'm going to rub out this lovely map now. We're going to draw up a map of Europe. I'm sure that will be just good banter for me. Alright, there were a lot of reasons for eventually what happened with the evacuation of Gallipoli, but a big part of it was Bulgaria. There were other Bulgaria wasn't the main reason. The situation was literally untenable. But what ended up happening was Hamilton, the leader of the expeditionary force, demanded 90,000 new troops to take out the Ottomans at the Dardanelles. The Allies said no because they were already planning a summer offensive. No, was it a spring offensive against the Germans on the Western Front, or against the Central Powers on the Western Front. However, what ended up happening was, this is what they did this way. So on, what was it? Okay, so the evacuation of Gallipoli took part in two stages. After the failed August offensive, the first stage, I believe, began in December 1915, and the last troops left in January 1916. Around, what was the date? 19th December, only 10,000 men held the lines of the trenches from Bolton Bridge in the south to Hill 60. I don't have the map still, but on the last day, troops and the last line were putting rifles on the trenches, and they had water buckets attached to them. It had little wires, so when the water would drip out, the gun would go off to make it look like the troops were still there. Eventually, by the start of 1916, all troops had evacuated. And that is... So I will now explain the effects of what happened. So virtually most troops ended up in Salonika, and then other troops were sent through the Mediterranean to southern France to be then transported to the Western Front. Most of the ANZAC troops were sent to the Western Front. However, there were consequences of what happened. One, it showed the Ottomans were stronger than everyone had thought they would be, and they were hard to knock out of the war. The other thing was entry of other Central Powers into the war made it more challenging to supply the Russian Empire that was to the north in the Black Sea, which became a very disastrous thing to occur since what occurred in 1917 in the Russian Revolution. Another issue was this train line. The train, this train line connected the main Ottoman Empire with Europe. It had been built years ago, before the First World War. But the thing was, it connected most of the empire. Someone you will probably have heard of was Lawrence of Arabia, also known as T.E. Lawrence. He went to, I believe, Jesus College at Oxford, could be wrong. But he was an archaeologist. He had gone around the Middle East and was well respected by many Arabs. However, at the time, many of the Arabs were feeling very oppressed by the Ottomans. Many of them were around this area in current-day Damascus, Jordan, Lebanon, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and places like that. So, what was the issue? Well, the British Empire decided that another sideshow was not going to be the way to go, and the war would be won on the Western Front. However, and they couldn't use the amount of troops that they used there for such a failure. So they thought the way they would do it is by weakening the Ottoman Empire from within, by supporting small tribal groups who were trying to win independence. This included Lawrence of Arabia, who ended up being British representative with the tribal groups, and ended up supplying them with weapons and things like that, to eventually, with the help of the British Navy, capture Damascus. Actually, was it Damascus? No, it wasn't Damascus. It was a peninsula town beforehand, so it was further down. But there were effects from the failure of the Gallipoli campaign, but it did also lead to eventually there were many successful Australian battles against the Ottoman Empire later in the war. There was the Battle of Tobruk, where the Australian light horse cavalry charged Ottoman positions and literally leapt over the trenches, taking the town and then virtually leading away through Israel and other positions of the Ottoman Empire, eventually leading to the capitulation of the empire and the later stages, and then eventually in 1921, I think it was, the Ottoman Empire was officially dissolved. I think it was 1921. The Ottoman Empire was dissolved when Mustafa Kemal led a revolution against the occupying forces of the Greeks, the British, the French, and other occupying forces to try and save the Turkish nation, which would become the Republic of Turkey, the modern-day country we know today. So yes, there were follow-on effects of the failed campaign at Gallipoli, but as today it is a very important day in Australia and New Zealand and other Commonwealth countries. So thank you for listening.